Have you ever had the feeling that you are playing a role? As if the person you show to the world is not exactly you? Maybe you look in the mirror, and for a brief moment, you don't recognize yourself. Or perhaps you spend the whole day fulfilling obligations, smiling, responding to messages, saying everything is fine, when in reality, something inside is silently crumbling. If this sounds familiar, then listen closely. You are not going crazy. You are awakening. Franz Kafka did not write to entertain. He wrote to expose the absurdity of modern existence, the silent pain of those who live without knowing why. His characters are not sick or lost. They are you. They are the raw and visceral representation of a human being crushed by a world that demands answers but never offers meaning. Kafka does not give you comfort. He gives you a mirror. A distorted mirror, yes, but only because the reality it reflects is already deformed by nature. He writes about men who wake up transformed into monsters, about bureaucracies that oppress without reason, about unreachable castles. But deep down, what he is saying is something very simple, and at the same time, brutal. You're not who you think you are, and this, if you have the courage, can be the beginning of everything. And the truth is this: your identity, your routine, your plans, your certainties. Perhaps all of this has been built to protect you from the pain of not knowing who you really are. But ignoring that pain will not make it disappear. It will only bury it deeper until the day it explodes, as happened with Kafka and with so many others who realized too soon that the life they were living was not theirs. So I ask you, how many more days do you intend to live as if you were someone else? Kafka once wrote, "Beyond a certain point, there is no return. This is the point that must be reached." And perhaps, just perhaps, that point is now. When Gregor Samsa wakes up and discovers that he has transformed into a monstrous insect, he does not scream, he does not panic, he does not question whether it is real. He only worries about being late for work. Take a moment to think about that. This is the Kafkaesque tragedy. The grotesque transformation of the body is less disturbing than the absurd pressure to keep functioning in a system that does not care who you are, only what you do. Kafka exposes dehumanization with surgical coldness. In The Metamorphosis, The Trial, The Castle, he does not present us with clear villains or comforting solutions. He places us in front of dead-end mazes where the individual is crushed by invisible and impersonal structures, and where suffering does not come from the malice of the world, but from its indifference. Joseph K., the protagonist of The Trial, is accused of a crime that is never explained. He is investigated, judged, condemned, and never discovers what the accusation was. This seems absurd, but think about it. How many times have you felt judged without knowing why? How many times have you carried guilt, shame, or fear without being able to name where it came from? Kafka does not create characters. He reveals what is behind the mask of each of us. He shows the collapse of identity when confronted with a world that demands senseless obedience, soulless adaptation, and performance without authenticity. And the most unsettling part, these characters continue trying to fit in, even as everything crumbles around them. This is where Kafka touches on a deeply psychological and existential point. Human beings prefer the pain of routine to the pain of freedom. We prefer to keep pretending that we know who we are, that we have control, that we are on the right path, than to face the abyss of a question that many avoid their entire lives. What if I am nobody? But here is the twist. It is precisely in this collapse, in this emptiness, in this not knowing, that something new can be born. Because sometimes, To discover who you really are, you first need to watch who you thought you were completely fall apart. In the next section, we will dive into the psychological labyrinth that Kafka predicted with chilling accuracy, and that we now call modern life. Prepare to confront the discomfort of seeing yourself in full. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. You wake up, have coffee, check your phone, respond to messages you don't want to answer, go to a job you don't love, talk to people you don't really know, smile out of obligation, come home exhausted, and repeat it all the next day. They call this life. But what if it's just a disguise? A script that was imposed on you before you could even make conscious choices. Kafka saw this before anyone else. He didn't live in the era of likes, burnout, or toxic positivity, but he perfectly described what we experience today. The constant feeling that we are trapped in a system that forces us to function, but never to live. In the castle, the protagonist tries at all costs to access a place that symbolizes power, belonging, and recognition. He tries to be accepted, tries to understand the rules, but the castle remains unreachable, always on the margins, always out of reach. A cruel metaphor for the modern quest for validation, status, and meaning. The Kafkaesque labyrinth is made of absurd rules, ambiguous language, empty promises. But the most perverse thing is that this labyrinth is internalized. Little by little, you start to blame yourself for not being able to get there. The pressure to be productive, happy, desirable, intelligent, spiritually elevated, all of this transforms into an endless cycle of self-judgment. And what's left of you in the midst of it? This is where psychology comes in. Jung would call this an inflated persona, the social mask we wear to be accepted. But when this persona becomes all that you are, when your essence bends to fit into a mold, the symptom is born. Anxiety, apathy, emptiness, insomnia, identity crises. The soul begins to scream inside, while you continue to smile on the outside. Kafka doesn't offer a cure, but he offers clarity. He shows that the labyrinth is not just out there, it's inside you. And only when you recognize this can you begin to chart a way out. But be careful. Leaving the labyrinth means giving up everything you once believed you were. And that hurts. It hurts like a symbolic death. The question is, are you willing to die to what you are not, to perhaps, just perhaps, be reborn to who you have always been? In the next section, we will explore what happens when this internal labyrinth closes off completely and the feeling of alienation takes over. What to do when you no longer recognize yourself nor the world around you. We will talk about Kafkaesque loneliness, the kind that doesn't come from the absence of others, but from the absence of oneself. You can be surrounded by people, meeting all expectations, living exactly as they said you should, and still feel as if you're floating in a void. It's a strange feeling, hard to explain, as if there were a thin film between you and the world. You see everything, participate in everything, but feel nothing. You are there, but you are not. Kafka understood this feeling with a chilling precision. He lived it. His entire life was marked by a profound disconnection from the world around him. He wrote in the early hours of the morning, alone, in silence. He was an obsessive observer of human existence, but always on the sidelines. For him, living was like being trapped in a body that never belonged, in a time that never made sense, surrounded by voices that did not listen and faces that did not truly see. This alienation is much more than loneliness. It is existential. It slowly corrodes. It starts with a slight discomfort, a feeling of inadequacy. Then it turns into chronic boredom, emotional disconnection, fatigue from your own presence. You start to avoid certain conversations because you know that no one would understand. You stop sharing what you feel because you already anticipate the emptiness of the response. Little by little, you begin to fade away. And the worst part? No one notices, because on the outside, everything is normal. Kafka does not romanticize this pain. He lays it bare. His characters live surrounded by figures that seem human, but are cold, mechanical, devoid of empathy. They are perfect reflections of a society that demands performance but offers no connection. They plead for meaning but receive silence. They seek justice only to find closed doors. They want to be seen but are ignored. This is Kafkaesque loneliness, being in the world without being part of it. And perhaps you are living exactly this right now. Perhaps you are watching this video in an attempt to find some echo, some confirmation that you are not completely alone in this void. And if that is the case, listen to this carefully. The alienation you feel is not a flaw of yours. It is a symptom of clarity. It is a sign that you still feel something that most have long since numbed. But there is a danger here. Because when alienation prolongs, it not only distances you from the world, it begins to pull you away from yourself. You forget what you like, what you believe, what you dreamed of. Your identity starts to dissolve until only a shadow of who you were remains. And it is at this point that many give up. But it is also at this point that some awaken. In the next section, we will talk precisely about this. What to do when the mind starts to scream for help. How to deal with this nameless anguish that consumes you from within. Kafka does not offer easy solutions, but he points to paths. And perhaps, in this labyrinth that seems to have no way out, pain is the only thread that can guide you back to yourself. The mind does not collapse all at once. It cracks little by little. First comes the fatigue, not physical, but existential. Waking up already feels heavy. Getting out of bed requires effort. Time begins to lose color, and days become purposeless repetitions. You still move, still fulfill tasks. But inside, everything feels suspended, distant, uninhabited. Kafka knew this agony deeply. He suffered from insomnia, anxiety, and panic attacks at a time when no one knew how to name it. But he transformed suffering into language, and language into a mirror. His stories are more than literature, they are diagnoses. Each character is a symbolic manifestation of a psychic state. Each setting is a metaphor for a suffering that at the time was invisible. Today, modern psychology would call it existential depression, ego collapse, identity crisis. Kafka called it living. The silent pain that seeps through the lines of his texts is the same that inhabits so many of us today. And the cruelest part, it is hard to explain. You try to vent, but the words fail. You say, "I'm tired," when in fact you are exhausted from existing. You say, "Everything's fine," when in reality you feel like you are falling apart inside. And as no one sees, you begin to doubt your own pain. You start to ask yourself, "Am I weak? Is it all in my head?" No, it is not weakness. It is a calling. The pain that Kafka describes is not a mistake. It is a sign. It appears when you have strayed too far from yourself, when you live a life that makes no sense to your soul, when you silence yourself so much that the psyche begins to scream. It's as if the unconscious says, "Either you stop, or I will stop you." And this scream can come in the form of anxiety attacks, panic attacks, depersonalization. a desire to disappear. And as frightening as it may seem, this is what can save you. Because suffering, when listened to attentively, becomes a compass. Deep anguish, when embraced without judgment, becomes a portal. It is precisely in this collapse that something new can begin to emerge. Not a new version of you, that's self-help language, but something deeper, the beginning of a return to who you are before you forgot. Kafka never offered relief. He offered mirrors, but every true mirror has the power to awaken. The question is, are you willing to look with honesty, to face what inhabits you and that you have spent years ignoring? In the next section, we will explore one of Kafka's most symbolic works, The Metamorphosis, as an archetypal script for this process of pain and rebirth. We will understand why sometimes it is necessary to become a monster before truly becoming human. Gregor Samsa wakes up and discovers that he has turned into an insect. It is one of the most impactful openings in literature. But what does this really mean? Kafka never explains why Gregor transformed. There is no curse, no accident, no physical cause. And it is precisely here that the power of this metaphor lies. Gregor's transformation is not literal. It is psychic. It is the grotesque materialization of an internal collapse that many of us live through in silence, the moment when the persona breaks and what was hidden finally emerges. For years, Gregor supported his family, repressed his desires, annulled his will. He was the obedient son, the exemplary employee, the good boy. But inside, there was frustration, anguish, resentment. His existence was a continuous sacrifice made in the name of a love that was never reciprocated. When he wakes up transformed, it is not the body that has changed. It is the soul that finally screamed louder than the mask he wore. At this point, Kafka's metaphor connects deeply with Jungian psychology. Carl Jung called this process the emergence of the shadow, when everything that has been repressed, denied, or forgotten in the unconscious returns with force. And the return is never pretty. It comes in the form of crisis, collapse, loss of control. The monster that Gregor becomes is the sum of everything he tried to hide from himself to be accepted. But beware. This monster is not an enemy. It is a messenger. It carries the truth that you refuse to hear. It represents the price of living a life that is not yours. And that is precisely why metamorphosis, as painful as it may be, can be a process of symbolic healing. Because only when you confront what you fear most within yourself do you begin to find liberation. Kafka forces us to look at what we do not want to see. And that is why so many people reject his works, not because they are difficult, but because they are mirrors. And what we see in them is not pleasant. Our apathy, our conformity, our cowardice in saying no. How many times have you hidden behind obligation? How many times have you annulled what you felt to keep the peace? How many times have you stopped living to fulfill what was expected of you? Gregor dies at the end of the story, alone, rejected, forgotten. But his death is not just a tragedy, it is a liberation. Because the true nightmare was not the metamorphosis, it was the life he led before it. The insect was not punishment, it was revelation. Now the question that remains is, are you also going through a metamorphosis and have not yet realized it? Is your current crisis, in fact, a brutal invitation from life to reinvent yourself? In the last part of this video, we will tie all of this together with a final reflection. The collapse of identity can be terrifying, but it can also be liberating. We will talk about how accepting that you are not who you thought you were can, paradoxically, be the first step to finally living with truth. It takes courage to deconstruct one's own identity. Most people spend their entire lives clinging to a false image of themselves, built on the expectations of others, childhood traumas, and the social roles they learned to play. But there comes a time when the mask starts to crack. And that's when many panic, trying to glue the pieces back together, trying to return to what they were never truly meant to be. Kafka teaches us that this rupture, no matter how painful it seems, is necessary. Because you're not your profession. You're not what your parents projected onto you. You are not your performance on social media, nor the role you assumed to survive. All of this may have been useful at some point. It may have protected you, given you a sense of belonging, helped you move forward. But now it is suffocating you. You feel it. Deep down, you know, the version of you that the world applauds is killing the version of you that is true. Franz Kafka did not write to please. He wrote to expose, to illuminate the dark corners of the human soul, to remind us that life is a process of constant detachment. You will need to let die ideas, images, identities that no longer serve you. And yes, it hurts. It hurts like a real loss. But in this morning, there is a rare chance, the chance to be reborn. The question you need to ask yourself now is not who am I, but rather, who would I be if I had the courage to abandon everything I was told I am? Do not wait for the world to authorize you to ask this question. It will never authorize it. Because an awakened human being, lucid, aware of their own emptiness, and at the same time of their own potential, is far too dangerous. They do not bend, they do not obey, they create their own path. So, if this video spoke to you, if at any moment you felt touched, seen, moved by these words, I want you to comment down below, I am in process. Because recognizing that you are in transition, that you are falling apart to rebuild yourself, is the first act of honesty with your own soul. And you can be sure, you are not alone. And before you go, keep watching. The next video is important. Perhaps more than you imagine. See you there.